It's a pleasure to welcome Emily Apter, who's going to speak this evening. The title of her lecture, which wasn't altogether wrong in the events list, is Nomadologies of Tomorrow, the Deleuzian Worldscape. Emily is currently Professor of Comparative Literature and Romance Studies and Chair of the Department of Comparative Literature at Cornell. And her books include André Gide and the Codes of Homosexuality, Feminizing the Fetish, Psychoanalysis and Narrative Obsession in Turn-of-the-Century France, and Fetishism as Cultural Discourse, a volume of essays co-edited with William Peets. Her most recent book, Continental Drift, From National Character to Virtual Subjects, is forthcoming from Chicago. Her projects at the moment include a study of translation and the global market, and Spaces of the Demi-Monde, fin de siècle subcultures, 1890s to the 1990s. Her recent articles have focused on topics such as translation and transnationalism, Algeria's post-colonial legacy, humanism without borders, and the status of the human, together with the representation of cultures of dependency in the photography of Brassai and of Nan Goldin. It's a very great pleasure to welcome Emily Apter.
Many thanks to Mark Cousins, and thanks for coming this evening. The other possible title for this talk would be Space Race. This paper addresses a number of interlinked concerns that each carry implied applications to contemporary conditions of architectural production. The first framework involves globalization's impact on the self-imaging of nation-states. It is becoming increasingly apparent that transnational interstate economies are colonizing individual nation-states, rendering them quasi-obsolete, even as they preserve the integrity of their differences for marketing purposes. In architecture, this kind of multinational nationalism, or consumerist national particularism, proves compatible with new iterations of corporate millennialism. And I'll have the first slide. This is the Millennial Dome project. The millennium, Peter Eisenman recently remarked, has emerged as one of the greatest marketing ploys in history. As millennial hype cuts across national boundaries, further weakening discrete, recognizable forms of national identity, trans-world aesthetics and cosmic projections of an alien nation increasingly make their appearance. This upmarket, new age flirtation with alien-ness provides the backdrop to critical architectural projects that overtly engage with a space-age formal vocabulary, magmas and blobs. This is the Future Systems blob office block, or astral abstractions, as in Zaha Hadid's Hong Kong Peak project, and an image that I found in the Documenta Politics catalog, and I can't remember what it is, but it sort of fits what I'm talking about. For race aliens, that is, members of minority populations habitually excluded from public forms of national self-representation, there is also a temptation to appropriate and remotivate a visual vocabulary of elsewhere, up, out, and beyond. For a number of years now, Black performers and artists have been experimenting with reclaiming the alien. Afrofuturism, from Sun Ra and George Clinton to the recent videos of John Akomfra and his Black Audio Collective, has launched its own distinctive space race, replete with miracles of teleportation and digitized race memories. And I'd like to now show you a clip from the Black Audio Collective's video, two titles.
Flash forward 200 years into the future. itself had become commercial. You know, it was hip to be black, you know, to do the music and dance of James Brown and all of that. So, and hip hop, I mean, rock and roll had just like faded out, you know, in '69. So it's time to make a change. This figure is a thief. He's a data thief. And he's surfing across the internet of black culture, breaking into the vaults, breaking into the rooms, stealing fragments. Fragments from cyberculture, technoculture, narrative culture. The data thief has two gadgets that he's going to use to navigate his way through our present. A black box and a rather special pair of sunglasses. G. Clinton, George Clinton, founder of Funkadelic. Funk, uncut funk, the bomb. George Clinton, I think, is a fucking maniac. I was fond of Star Trek. Star Trek freak, sci-fi freak. So the next record I had to find another place that he hadn't perceived like it would be. And that was on a spaceship. So I pictured him like never leaving, you know, like a cat, like sliding into space, little children, you know, having come here from the planet Sirius. I would see a concert when I was a little kid at this place called the Olympia Ballroom here in Detroit. I'll never forget it. I mean, that was like, for me, that was my first concert I've ever been to in my life. And I remember it because I'll never forget this man coming out the top of the roof on a cable, dressed in a diaper and big white platform boots, playing a guitar, and called himself Star Child. You know, and this other dude walks out of a so-called spaceship that lands out of the middle of the stage, and these guys are playing this music. You know, when I think about it right now, I'm there.
The military connection is Clinton's symbol for what happens to funk when you pass it through the studio and when it becomes kind of astral or becomes space or becomes extraterrestrial. The military connection is like the link between Africa as a lost continent in the past and between Africa as an alien future.
Okay, that's. Thanks. Enforcing confrontations between race and space, identity and genetic transformation, Afrofuturism taps into the zeitgeist's anxieties over the precariousness of the here and now, or even more specifically, the uncertainty of what it means to be human. It is surely no coincidence that a spate of recent novels and art projects have taken on the task of picturing the face of the post-human, exploring the provisionality of humanoidness by cloning primates who are all too human. Turner Prize runner-up Christine Borland rescued and recast mutant heads, some of them clearly morphs of monkey and human, from a clinical museum in Germany, where they were no doubt used as teaching aids in courses on eugenics and the master race. A nouveau Darwinian ape man stars in Peter Hoag's book, The Woman and the Ape, where the narrative crescendos in scenes of interspecial lovemaking. In Will Self's latest novel, Great Apes, the ontological state known as chimpunity is explored in a virtual world inhabited by primates with career ambitions, everyday habits, and routines just like us, only with fewer sexual hang-ups, since they don't object to sex with family members or mating in front of the children before breakfast. What strikes me as relevant to architecture in this fantasy of a post-human or supra-animal world order is that interspecial sex can be extended into reproductive transactions between animate and inanimate matter. The title of a make-believe reference work in Self's novel Great Apes, called A Chimp Who Mated an Armchair, cited by the chimp doctor Zach Busner, who specializes in studying apes suffering from the delusion that they are human, the reader is invited to conjure up the strange progeny of primates and domestic architecture. Chimp chairs or buildings with simian morphologies, bodies cut into primatological sections or plans, blurred boundaries between inert object and live form. And here I think you could even easily imagine a studio devoted to architectural investigations of the boundaries between the human and furniture, the human and building, if it's not being explored already. Though the land of apes is far afield from what I really want to talk about, which are the sci-fi spacescapes of Afrofuturism, I think these diverse themes come together in attempts to figure the alien in a millennial key. And so without further preface, I'll proceed to where I originally began in this paper, namely with some reflections on Gilles Deleuze's theory of nomadology. In an essay entitled Off-White, Arjun Appadurai surmised, quote, "The violence that surrounds identity politics around the world today reflects the anxieties attendant on the search for non-territorial principles of solidarity." Appadurai's vision of a post-national condition comprised of deterritorialized subjects, refugees and migrants who create transnational communities regardless of national boundaries or official language, diasporic enclaves refusing to be assimilated by their adopted countries, ethno-nationalist mobilizations of capital and information, seems to echo, however indirectly, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's call for philosophical reterritorialization, a refaulting of global outlines estranging the universality of national democracies and enabling citizens to experience what they call becoming other. Deleuze and Guattari's presciently post-national vision of deterritorialized subjects associated in anti-Oedipus capitalism and schizophrenia with the body without organs, the desiring machine, genic decoding, vectors of partial objects and flows, and gerundive ontologies like becoming another sex, becoming God, becoming a race, conjugates otherness with futurology. What results is a post-nation state populated by citizens whose tribal loyalties and patriotic memories are subjectively intact but continentally adrift. While Jean-François Lyotard has offered a vivid articulation of the perspectively upended scapeland or burrow in his essays on the inhuman, such as the mole's myopic tunnel as seen by a bird, the Earth seen from the moon for an extraterrestrial, and so on, Deleuze and Guattari were unique in inscribing the politics of a shifting worldscape into projections of a denationalized subject. With its millennial and 60s-style revolutionary inflections, their writing foretold a post-national condition that lined up eerily with sci-fi visions of extraterrestrial conquest. And I quote, "In imperial states, deterritorialization takes place through transcendence. It tends to develop vertically from on high according to a celestial component of the earth. The territory has become desert earth, but a celestial stranger arrives to reestablish the territory or reterritorialize the earth." Though this passage, in context, functions somewhat allegorically as part of their critique of the imperial spatium in ancient Greece, it alerts us nonetheless to the way in which Deleuze and Guattari used the celestial stranger as a means of expanding parameters for thinking the world. The radical globalism of their geophilosophy, crucial to why one might be tempted to envision the next millennium as turning on a Deleuzian century, invites us to look for signs of post-national futures in the territorially unbounded genres of cyberfiction. In cyber-fi, the monuments, street plans, and characters that proverbially function as psychic ledgers of urban identity, triggering emotion at the mere utterance of place names, Moscow, Mexico City, Paris, Cape Town, Berlin, Los Angeles, London, Beijing, are supplanted by shapeless cartographies. The traffic embankment, sealed off from view by metal splash guards, strewn with wreckage and harboring a crash victim for whom nobody whizzing on the motorway will stop in J.G. Ballard's Concrete Island. This is an image that reminded me of that. Typifies the genre's technologically wasted, contourless no man's land. Lunar and lunatic, stepped and iced over, deforested and scavenged, warped and melted down, this smooth space, as defined by Deleuze and Guattari, delivers catatonia and rush, and is identified with the moved body going from one point to another in a striated space. Smooth space aligns the aerodynamic whoosh of the war machine with the locomotion of displaced nomads who have learned to stay put in flight. The deterritorialized terrain of nomadology, by now a consecrated fetish of architectural fantasy, is plotted rhizomatically in Deleuze and Guattari's book, Nomadology, the War Machine, in terms of a riotous, hectic polity. The state apparatus has withered away, yielding political ground to the pack, warriors of indiscipline who question honor, practice blackmail, and adhere to a volatile sense of honor. Planar, immanent, syntagmatic, and connective, or recombinant, to use William Gibson's updated terminology, smooth space, like Ballard's Traffic Island, is, quote, indefinite and non-communicating, a local absolute. The culturally abstracted subjects of geophilosophical smoothness take what Deleuze and Guattari call the pledge of hijira, or emigration. In the proliferating genres of post-colonial cyberpunk and Afrofuturism, I would argue, we find what is perhaps the most compelling example of a Deleuzian nomadology of tomorrow, spatially driven and urbanistically attenuated. The alien quality of Ballardian industrial parks, low-tech aesthetics, and eco-genocide takes on enhanced political resonance in third-world cinema and fiction. Consider, for example, Kidlak Tahimik's The Perfume Nightmare, a 1977 cult film about a Filipino jeepney driver whose childhood idealization of the American space mission, he's founder of the Werner von Braun fan club, crumbles under the weight of Paris in the throes of so-called urban renewal. If you look at the corner down there, that's the image that he distributes to the local fans of the spacewalk. And then this is Kidlot going up from the supermarket, a Parisian supermarket, into a spaceship. What Jameson called the ugly poured concrete masses of the new supermarkets that fall into traditional arrondissements like meteorites from the future. Another example is found in the subversively priced 10-franc novel, The Petrified Savannah, a satire of racial politics in the post-colony by the Afro-Caribbean writer Raphael Confiant. The narrator is a Martinican author monitoring his culture's glacialization under the North American influence of cable TV, while a French academic, in search of black orality, becomes mired in the cultural and linguistic complexities of modern créolité. The novel's title page, featuring a small screen with the letters CNN blocked against a wavy background, conjures up the smooth space of the airwaves. In Confiant's fiction, the parched topographies of tropical fiction converge with the technologically scarified landscape of post-colonial cyberpunk. Here, Creole vitalism becomes the pendant to Afrofuturism. Asteroids are replaced by the molten magma of the Earth's core, and virtual subjects, instead of releasing themselves into outer space, incubate in, quote, the mangrove swamp of virtualities, thereby going to ground. In a related vein, modernity in the form of eco-alienness is periodically portrayed in pitched battle with traditionalism on the desiccated Algerian plain of Tahar Jaout's novel, L'Invention du désert, The Desert's Invention. This is one of the Algerian writers assassinated several years ago, where the wrath of the imams is impotently directed at an incinerator spewing polymers, bottles of Pepsi, bits of steel and plastic into the wasted deserts around. Alienness of a biotechnological order receives a post-colonial twist in Amitav Ghosh's 1995 The Calcutta Chromosome, a novel of fevers, delirium, and discovery. The ID card of a vanished employee, its plastic laminate warped and melted along the edges, its lettering mostly illegible, and its photograph vanished under a smudge of soot, shows up on the computer screen like a viral alien or intrusion. Interfering with the workings of LifeWatch Systems, a small but not respected nonprofit organization that serves as a global public health consultancy and epidemiological databank. This errant ID ensnares Antar, an Indian techie who works for the company as a programmer, in a mystery leading back to the days of empire. His quest to retrieve El Muragan reveals that prior to his disappearance, Muragan was on track to discredit the British claim to malarial cure, billed as the cold fusion of the colonial era. Spiritualists, ghosts, gurus, and supernatural coincidences now encumber the story of Sir Ronald Ross's scientific victory with Orientalist claptrap that cannot be dismissed or rationally explained away, despite the fact that it is stored in a databank and technologically managed. As Antar probes the LifeWatch files for clues to deciphering the codes of viral afterlife, he stumbles instead on reincarnation rituals that double as technological experiments in controlled destiny. He also uncovers the face of the future human in the vector where genetic coding is crossed with digital engineering. Antar meets his own decomposing cadaver, technically imaged on the screen in future time, in the guise of a leering post-human hologram. Where Amitav Ghosh figures the beyond of post-colonial identity by combining Orientalist spiritualism with DNA cyber-fi, the African-American jazz novelist Nathaniel Mackey uses music as the race alien's preferred medium. Let's see if I have any slides. Yeah, that's good. In Mackey's epistolary novel, Bedouin Hornbook, 1986, the titles of musical compositions are inspired by covert signals from another realm of consciousness. The work called Eventual Elegy, part of the longer oeuvre Aggravated Ascent, is said to originate, quote, millions of years ago, the ambiguous verdict of a galaxy-wide dispute between conscious and mechanical forces. One of the band's players, a character known by the moniker Jarred Bottle, is featured as hailing from interstellar space, a test tube baby who's been unalterably, involuntarily forwarded as by a conveyor belt. I think this novel really does match up very interestingly with the Mothership Connection video by the Black Audio Collective. Jarred Bottle's theme song, I Can't Get Over You, is vested with the key to extraterrestrial ontology. No simple love lament, it functions as, quote, a shorthand treatise whose namesake brooding had to do with an ontic, unbridgeable distance, a cosmogonic, uncrossable gap. If Jarred Bottle's creation suggests a fleet of black spacewalkers exploring alternative subjectivities in cosmic hotspots of future time, other members of the band experiment with backwards temporal travel. In a piece called The Slave's Day Off, archaic memories of slave experience are dredged up and delivered to a present-day avant-garde California musical gig, thanks to the hyper-historical archival coefficient provided by the Afrofuturist Omniverse Orchestra Band, Sun Ra. Is everyone familiar with Sun Ra? Because a little bit further on the Mothership Connection tape, there's an image of them. Should I? Okay, let's have a little bit more of the clip. Okay.
The music is different, you know. The vibrations are different. Sun Ra. George Clinton's mentor. Period.
was from about 1955 on Sun Ra's band. And Mothership Connection, which was George Clinton's major Earth tour from about 1977, are three spaceship images that these musicians are using as vehicles for this kind of subversion that I'm talking about, or this idea that I'm talking about of exploration.
I am the permanent computer. I am the sky computer. I am the Arabic computer. Space for black people is not something new. I really believe that we've been there, that we're returning to that, and that the consciousness of black people, all mankind, is striving to return to where the essence of the roots have come from. Whether somebody came in and gave us our intellect genetically, cloned us, switching on our genes to start evolving the way we have, or that we are descendants from the stars.
The data thief knows there's a connection between music, space, and the future. Entering a room marked space exploration, he finds the name Bernard Harris, astronaut. He asks him, what does the mothership connection mean to you?
I just love this.
To me, number one, in college, we used to party off this album quite a lot. But it's also a reflection of one man's vision of the future, and that is us as human beings exploring space, but more importantly, a black man, black people out exploring space. We're doing that now. We're going to be doing that in the future.
Okay, thank you. That's it. Great. Music similarly performs the work of healing and analysis. We're back to Nathaniel Mackey now. In the opus titled Bottomed Out, inspired by subliminal racial messages beamed through the billboards of San Francisco. In an advertisement for whipped cream and cake, the trauma of slavery is accessed through scrambled references to whipping, sexual subordination, and substance abuse. This is a passage I'll quote from the novel. The billboard carried an ad in which a piece of cake was pictured sitting on a plate. It was a piece of devil's food cake beneath a mound of whipped cream, on top of which sat a glossy red cherry. At the base of the ad were the words, "Top your favorite bottom with real whipped cream." We stared, not knowing exactly what about the ad had gotten Penguin worked up. "Can't you see it?" he answered. "It's the same oppressive meal they've always dished out, only now they're trying to pass it off as dessert." He made the point that one couldn't help hearing echoes of deserve in the word dessert, that one was being invited to buy into something he termed saccharine abuse, being invited to endorse a code of justified injustice. The rest of what he had to say turned largely on the words top and bottom. Their use in the ad, he argued, was loaded with meanings they brought from the SM world, whose parlance, as you no doubt know, equates top with dominant, bottom with submissive, top with actor, bottom with acted on, top with master, bottom with slave. It was the SM ruse of consent he found so offensive, he explained, especially given the ad's white over black theme or insinuation. Exemplary deconstructors of white society's racial unconscious, paranoid and projective in their worldview, the protagonists of Mackey's Bedouin Hornbook pay a dreamy homage to George Clinton's heroes of astrofunk, those cosmonauts of deep space mining black holes, preparing the next big bang, and negotiating the condition of throne being or perpetual flight. Illustrating Greg Tate's surmise that, quote, ironically, one of the things that's allowed black culture to survive is its ability to operate in an iconoclastic way in regard to the past. The trappings of tradition are never allowed to stand in the way of innovation and improvisation. Bedouin Hornbook recasts alienation as a term that carries the memory of African dispossession into modernist forms of African American culture. In this respect, the novel could be placed on a continuum along the websites, installations, and videos of the artist Renee Green. This is her 1996 digital import funk office. Music memory links prompting mnemonic investigation of the embrace of technoscience by black performers of the 70s prevail in a talk that Green delivered at Diedrich Dietrichson's conference on Loving the Alien, Diaspora Science Fiction and Multiculture. The vestigial memory of an album cover featuring Herbie Hancock in a spaceship bubble flying over a purple spacescape on the album called Thrust spikes a pileup of associations: ethereal drums, silver clothes, the Apollo space mission, Star Trek's lone female astronaut, Uhura, whose name means freedom in Swahili, and so on and so on. Let's see if I have, that's another slide from the Renee Green project. These ganglia of impressions prompt reflections on the relevance of 70s funk to obsessions of the late 90s, and these are Green's terms: alien within, blood relations, germ warfare, becoming alien, loss of control, etc. Afrofuturism is also the guiding theme of Ralph Lemon's choreography for Geography, recently performed at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. Oops. That's upside down, I'm sorry. That's the map that was included in the program for the work. It's a rhizomatic work of African dance, very Deleuzian, subjecting traditional African drum rhythms and steps to the breakage and spin of American modern dance, and nomadized still further by, those are some of the costumes. Nari Ward's techno bidonville set designs of distressed, washed-out scrims and shimmering walls of recycled bottles, and by DJ Spooky's overtly Deleuzian score. Afrofuturism has perhaps come up with its most distinctive version of rhizomatic art and Deleuzian smooth space in the form of paraspace, an idea developed by the African-American sci-fi writer and semiotician Samuel R. Delany to conjure a life world of effaced nationalism, blunted characters, and psychic extremes. And the Mothership video has some extended interviews with Delany and some other people about the novel I'm going to talk about now. Delany's sci-fi epic Dahlgren, first published in 1975, locates its characters in a space between urban dysfunction and psychological projection. Dahlgren's protagonist, the kid, suffers from a malevolent environmentalism that could trendily be described as spatial deficit disorder, but which clearly resembles old-fashioned urban paranoia. And he says, this is from the novel, "What makes it terrible is that in this timeless city, in this spaceless preserve where any slippage can occur, these closing walls, laced with fire escapes, gates, and crenellations, are too unfixed to hold it in, so that, as from a moving node, it seems to spread, by flood and seepage, over the whole uneasy scape." In a brief discussion of Dahlgren, I want to examine the conceptual and political stakes of this uneasy scape, emphasizing the worldscape over the netscape. The former I consider to be a virtual space with distinctly urban scar tissue. The latter, that is the netscape, I consider to be more of a retail mall. At first reading, cyberpunk appears to delocalize urban sites and wipe out historical memory. Likewise, smooth space may appear aggressively anti-urban as it renders visible markers of the city blurred or illegible. But I would suggest that in Delany's paraspatial fiction, a raced worldscape emerges, one that seems to echo Deleuze and Guattari's theoretical vision in its engagement with history. Class and race warfare are visualized through futurological landscaping. The worldscape registers the emergence of a predominantly black survivalist culture that redefines the hegemonic contours of the traditional herbs. Actually, I think we can turn the lights on. I think that's it for the slides, so have the lights up. In Dahlgren, the inhabitants of the city of Bologna learn that they've been cursed by their own private blitzkrieg, while the rest of the country, New York to Los Angeles, has apparently been spared. Though occasional newspapers get through, an informational impasse renders citizens primally obtuse. The question, what happened, remains intractable. The phenomenal world emits signals, but the populace has knowledge only of a lobotomized cause of urban fear. This is a passage from the book. But do you know how terrible it is to live inside here? She gestured at the green walls with everything slipping away. And you can hear everything that goes on in other rooms and other apartments. I wake up at night and walk by the window, and I can see lights sometimes moving in the smoke. And when the smoke isn't so heavy, it's even worse, because then the lights look like horrible things crawling around. This has got to stop, you know. Management must be having all sorts of difficulty while we're going through this crisis. I understand that. I make allowances. But it's not as though a bomb had fallen or anything. If a bomb had fallen, we'd be dead. This is something perfectly natural, and we have to make do, don't we, until the situation's rectified? She leaned forward. You don't think it is a bomb? Forced to submit to the mental strain of extreme hypotheticals, the characters of Dahlgren trivialize their unthinkable misfortune, treating it as an aberrant form of the everyday. A coping function, raw nerve endings waving wildly, has become a communal reflex. Domestic routines continue as before in sections of semi-abandoned apartment buildings not yet turned over to squats. The poet, Mr. Newboy, seems only dimly aware that half of his house has been trashed and looted. Informed by management that part of his home is off limits, he simply doesn't venture there anymore. In Dahlgren, the middle-class home is the site where the emergent worldscape erupts most visibly. In the chapter The House of Axe, the Richards family plans a move from 17E to 19A, that is, to an apartment in the same building exactly resembling the layout of their old one, only in reverse. Though violent, druggy scorpions have occupied the floor below, the scorpions are a lumpen warrior hipster class, arrayed in dog collars, chains, and switchblade wristlets. The Richards seem unable to process the fact that they are homesteading in a survivalist enclave. Their relocation involves a painstakingly slow transfer of a domestic effluvia, helped along by an odd-job man with literary pretensions. That's the kid. The kid moves freely between the porn and scavenger demimonde of the scorpions and the middle class. Like the smooth social paraspace of Bologna, where everyone is skidding, Kid's persona has lost its class bearings. He reviles the Richards family because it's not paying him, but takes refuge in Mrs. Richards' maternal care. The farcical ordinariness of apartment life vanishes when the Richards' children, June and Bobby, decide to bring a rolled-up carpet to the new place. And I quote briefly again. Out in the hall, June screamed. A long scream he could hear, empty of all breath. Then she screamed again. Mrs. Richards opened her mouth without sound. One hand shook by her head. He dashed between the television and the tables, out the door. The rug lay on the floor, the last foot sagging over the sill in the empty elevator shaft. The door nudged it, went ka-chunk, retreated, then began to close again. Mom, Bobby, he fell in the ka-chunk. No, oh God, no. Bobby, this is this child, has stepped into a blind elevator shaft. The ka-chunk sound is the phonic announcement of urban panic, shattering the psychic fortress of denial. Relying on scorpion help, the kid descends into the death shaft and trawls up his final movable item. Bobby's disfigured corpse is delivered over the din of Dragon Lady's pitiless roar. Your son is dead, lady. The Richards cope with Bobby's death with surreally sunny socializing, abandoning the body to putrefaction in the old apartment. Kid, by contrast, becomes delusional, subject to hallucinations and blackouts. After initially suspecting foul play by Bobby's sister, vulnerable to her brother's threat to out her as a secret porn addict, the kid falls prey to a terrifying conviction that the death was accidentally committed by the city itself. Because that means it's the city. That means it's the landscape, the bricks and the girders and the faulty wiring and the shot elevator machinery all conspiring together to make these myths true. And that's crazy. Do you think a city can control the way people live inside it? I mean, just the geography, the way the streets are laid out, the way the buildings are placed? Kid's friend Tak interprets this evidence of city murder as proof that Bologna has been trapped in science fiction. The kid says, "You mean a time warp or a parallel universe?" "No, just, well, science fiction, only real. It follows all the conventions." Here Delaney mines the cliché of a lurking phantasm, a premise in films like Escape from New York or Safe, that these streets have become so mean, we're no longer projecting cyberpunk's worst urban fear, we're it. Exploring the mental warp and woof of urban dwelling as a heightened self-consciousness about acting out sci-fi, the narrative folds, in a Deleuzian way, like a Leibnizian pleat or Mobius strip. Inside and outside, here and there, fantasy and fiction, subject and city ripple, as if illustrating the formula that Kid discovers in a manuscript distilling Wittgenstein, Levi-Strauss, and Chomsky. Quote, "A particularly parametric work of careful crystalline catalysts in lingual synthesis." Though apparently meaningless, these lingual syntheses might be said to apply quite aptly to the porn-driven, retro-futurist industrial vernacular spoken by the Scorpions, as in that naugahyde rimmer of rusty Chevrolet 1952 exhaust pipes. I hope the next time she sucks off a number, she rips his foreskin in her bridge work. There are pages and pages of prose like this where you actually have to kind of take your time and work it out, because a lot of it is slang, argot, and references to 70s products that may not exist anymore. If Dahlgren experiments with linguistic sex and violence to capture post-urban zombification, it also defines Bologna libidinously as a saprophytic city, meaning an organism that feeds on decay, a place where you can have your fantasy and eat it too. The fantasies that prove particularly edible in Bologna center on the fascinating and psychotropic detail of group sex and on black people. Quote, "A lot of people came into the room, coffee, chocolate, and tamarindo faces, hands and shoulders swung by, turning as chains from long or stocky necks swung under several hairdos of beach ball dimensions. Blackness is satirized as alien junk food and fetishized in jet vinyl crowned with celestial naturals. The black techno-body remains a staple of Delaney's experimentation with futurological subjectivities. In the 80s, he would valorize matte black in the semiotics of Afrofuturism. Though Delaney cautions that when one talks about black youth culture as a technological culture, one has to specify that it's a technological culture that's almost entirely on the receiving end of a river of stuff, in which the young consumers have nowhere near what we might call equitable input. His fiction approves a riskier approach to Afrofuturist identities. Taking on Negro grotesques from repressed memory, best personified by the jocular, ironically named unrepentant black rapist George Harrison, he jumbles them up with half-breeds, hippies, race baiters, and white supremacists, creating scenarios in which the conventions of speculative fiction are used to complicate paradigms of racial subjection. Thwarting the reader's potential desire for a blacker novel, Dahlgren trumps the race card by desegregating neighborhoods, depicting good interracial sex, banalizing racist epithets, and confounding vital statistics, as in the case of Kid, who's introduced as age ambiguous, racial origin same, true name unknown. Consistently, references to racial identity are erratically introduced, as in 5 were sitting on the steps, 2 leaned against the wrecked car at the curb. Why am I surprised that most of them are black? The flower children, whose slightly demonic heirs these are, were so emphatically blonde, and the occasional darky among them such an emphatic mark of tolerance. In a sequel novel, Trouble on Triton, an ambiguous heterotopia published in 1976, skin color fails to be processed racially by a super-Aryan interplanetary visitor named Braun. And here's this little scene. 2 people coming up the center of the road, from braided hair to crusted boots. They were the dirtiest people Braun had seen since Fred. One kept digging a middle finger under the lens of some goggle-like things perched on her nose. The dirt, however, wasn't black or gray, but sort of brownish. Sending up racist cliches, Delaney defamiliarizes the historic normativities of skin color. Like Ishmael Reed, Octavia Butler, Ursula Le Guin, Nathaniel Mackey, Renee Green, and the Black Audio Collective, among many others now, Delaney seems more interested in unraveling the psychic underpinnings of alienness within color coding than in confirming the preordained contours of a racist world. I'll conclude by suggesting that far from being simply displaced into literary urban form or commercialized as New Age others, as in Orson Scott Card's Xenocide and Ender's War, Delaney's race aliens remind us that, quote, African Americans in a very real sense are the descendants of alien abductees. Even, I think that was Greg Tate, even as they become the organic fiber of the nomadological worldscape, part of the deep space that is impossible to detect, but which holds up the atmosphere, part of the air that is breathed or not breathed, part of the wildly black market of its absent economy, part of the global compass set to readjust worldview. Delaney's astrocentric novel, Trouble on Triton, captures the imperial state's free fall from transcendence to immanence as it becomes reterritorialized in its turn. Earth's hubris shrinks when perceived from the solar system's outer Mongolia. Galaxies outflank planetary orbits. Continents become indistinguishable loci of memory. Cultural landmarks lose their hegemonic grip on the world map, and cities shrink to minuscule dots vanishing from sight altogether. One of the characters says, the Taj Mahal, would he get to see it after all? He must ask Sam how far away it was. That was much more interesting than Boston. But though he knew all about the clay pits to the south of it and the story of the queen who died in childbirth buried within it, he wasn't sure which continent it was on, one of them beginning with A, Asia, Africa, Australia. As the letter A skids along the names of continents, so Braun, in the process of completing a high surveillance mission, speeds from point to point in space. Viewed from where he sits, the Earth's surface resembles the tessellated abstraction of the Deleuzian Worldscape, a horizonless milieu that is a smooth space, steppe, desert, or sea. Thank you. There are a lot of literary examples in this, so it may be kind of difficult. But if anybody also wants to return to either some of the images in the video or some of the concerns raised at the beginning about questions of the inhuman or millennial problems, this might be a good moment to bring those up too. It doesn't have to be directly addressed to the close readings in the talk, which were well, that's fine. Yes.
In the figuring of the sort of architecture scape at the beginning, the millennial dome as a sort of empty millennial concept, the architecture in space, right? And connecting that to blackness coming from space as alien other. Are you saying that the architecture in some way is figuring an Earth that is become alien because of its mechanical inhuman contents, or are you saying it prefigures a space that can be reoccupied by aliens?
No, what I'm trying to suggest, and again, it's sort of a stretch to any obvious architectural application, but I think I would point in some ways to the very strange sets that Sun Ra and Clinton invented as, I mean, I think the basic premise there is that to come with the legacy of slavery, you are an alien in this land, and therefore there's a sense of reclaiming the alien in terms of sci-fi imagery, which is where Delaney, I think, situates himself as a writer. In terms of this question of the void and time and travel in space and outer space, I mean, I sort of get what you're saying, but I'm not sure what the connection would be. I mean, I think what happens is that there's a kind of dovetailing with a more commercialized millennial thinking that's becoming increasingly hot at the moment, for obvious reasons. And there are just different motivations coming together. And I think what I'm trying to do is define, to introduce the question of race into space, because it doesn't belong there technically. I mean, it doesn't have a literal way of expressing itself if you're talking about a millennial project. Perhaps the whole question of outer space being darkness, that's a whole resonance I hadn't even thought about, but it certainly would apply. But I think in terms of Afrofuturism as a growing and conscious movement that's experimenting with different kinds of avant-garde form, there is a sense of something more historical, which is historical ways in which black culture has figured itself as alien in a white planet. And that's so. But with Delaney, it's even more complicated than that, because he also refuses any kind of essentialist notion of black space in the novel. I mean, it doesn't fall easily into that. So it's introduced here and there. You know, he's held up even in the Mothership video as the kind of father of black sci-fi. But it's very hard actually to say this is a black novel, that gives you a literal image of black space. It's all in the innuendo, and it's in a kind of what he calls in the video allusions to an inner city that's been sort of strangely wiped out, and partly because he says that that's habitually where inner city has connoted dispossessed and disenfranchised black ghettos, and so he's sort of saying, that's right, so we'll reclaim it. I don't know if that makes it any clearer. But
my question is really not formulated at all, but I was really struck by this thing that was in the tape where the guy said something like, Africa is a continent lost in the past, and Africa is an alien future. And the way the tape used a lot of Egyptian imagery, which is partly referring to Sun Ra, but this sort of computerization of hieroglyphics and so on. And I was very interested in the idea of somehow this black futurism being a way to kind of scoop up Egypt and so on as a kind of sci-fi effect. And also I was interested in this other thing that you spoke about the apes motif, which is like about a relationship to biology and genetics. And what happens when you put biology into history in the way that Peter Hogue does in that novel, trying to sort of make a kind of science fiction, a biological science fiction. And it seemed, it just stimulated in me thoughts about race as a biological construct, race as a social construct, race as a historical construct, and what happens when you try to sort of project or propel race into a future construct.
I think what you raise is a point that I didn't necessarily emphasize enough in so many words at the beginning, but you have to understand, and I'm sure those of you who've been involved in architecture are very well aware of this, that all of African culture has been, for better or for worse, often pedagogically packaged or presented to the Western world as traditional and without technology. And I think I should sort of preface what I say, that one can't underestimate what's going on here, which is to say, no, we will not just continue this cliche about not having access to technology. Now, I think the Egyptian stuff works in here because it's not it's linked to an argument that was, of course, made academically later by Martin Bernal and Black Athena, that is that there is no strict division now between Africa and Greece or Africa and the West, that it's a little bit more complicated in terms of historic race maps and culture maps and civilizations. So I think there's this really concern to kind of explode these categories of tradition versus modernity, traditional society, village culture. That's not to say they're not respected, but they're not left in their integrity as in a kind of time warp. And the problem is that, anyone who's been to third world cultures realizes there's no third world. I mean, there is digital technology, there is self-fashioning through technology. It's obviously less in volume than in Western cities, but there isn't the strict division anymore. So I think part of what they do avant la lettre, that is before the Black Athena book comes along and sort of says, well, there is Egypt in Greece, or there is no, and in some Afrocentric terms, it's sort of, we are the center of civilization, of the West, of Western civilization. There have been a lot of strategic appropriations about who lays claims to the origin of great civilization. But I think, whether consciously or intuitively, that Sun Ra was picking up on this in terms of scrambling the references, scrambling the divisions historically. But the other question is, and I'm kind of worried about this in setting up some of these parallels, but I do think they're connected, is once you introduce the question of Afrofuturism and genetic engineering and paranoid fantasies about this, it does tap directly into these other kinds of works that we're seeing that are dealing with the fear that, fear of a kind of prosthetic subjectivity or biotechnologically engineered subject that will emerge after the millennium. And one way to kind of get at that is, of course, to go toward the subhuman or the inhuman. And this, I haven't really thought it all through, but I think the connections again to traditions of racist traditions within eugenics comes right back, and I think is being engaged with critically by a number of writers and artists. But there are more connections there than I've even really begun to think through. And what is the, I wish I could be more precise about how I would relate something like Hoag's novel to Delaney, for example, but I think there are connections there.
Can I ask about, really kind of starts with the last point about Bernal. I mean, I wasn't quite sure what you were saying, because it seems to me, on the one hand, Bernal's engaging in an incredibly traditional kind of humanist-based claim, even if it's functioning as a counterclaim, that somehow it's to kind of Africanize Greece.
Right.
I mean, I don't like the book anyway, but I mean, it does seem to be, whatever kind of else one could say about it, that it's very traditional. Whereas a lot of what you're talking about is kind of a much more radical attempt to break any kind of humanist kind of recuperation by talking about kind of identifications with an alienness which includes like the non-human.
Yeah, right.
And that always seems to me to have been one of the major kind of challenges to a certain kind of philosophical and political humanism. The problem, in a sense, is that it's a challenge which has come from the right as much as from kind of the left. I mean, it doesn't seem to me, whatever kind of virtues it might have at a kind of theoretical and philosophical level, it's obviously kind of politically problematic, because if it can kind of fracture a certain kind of worldly humanism, which is indeed the mask for a certain kind of transnational consumerism, nonetheless it can also function in a sense as a kind of fascist kind of theory of sort of strength. I mean, if one thinks of someone like Ernst Jünger or something, where there is an identification with the machine or whatever. So, I mean, it sort of seems to me, that to introduce a real kind of political instability. I mean, that's not a criticism.
No,
it's just.
No, I think that's a really
it's
good
a
point
price on
about
pays.
the Bernal text, which has been, very controversial, and I'm not sort of holding it up as the answer, but more as a book that attempted to kind of to give some kind of academic argument to what seems to be happening in popular culture, which is a contestation of Greece and so on and so forth. So that's a sort of simple point. But the other point you raise about what are the politics of all of this, of identifying with the alien. I mean, I think within these representations within African American culture, there is both a sense of radical protest that, the line that's repeated in the video that you didn't get it very spelled out, but it's that the insistence on the sense of being an alien and identifying with an alien very naturally, because not belonging has been part of post-slavery history. But it's tempting to kind of push this further and say, what does it mean to identify with the alien? What kind of forms? I mean, I think part of it is there's a sense of an exhaustion of forms within humanism. Humanism has its repertory. It has its monumental, consecrated codes of representation, of building, of monumental faces. And now, with new kinds of technologies, you're beginning to, as I think people have talked about, you can build things differently. You don't have to adhere to a humanist vocabulary. You're not constrained actually by materials or specs. And so the question is, once that is increasingly loosened up and liberated, what kinds of alien structures are going to appear? And in a sense, but then there's always this back to the future paradigm of, well, it's retrofuturism again. It always seems to look old. Futurism is constantly quoting the 60s, quoting the 70s. Can that alienness have another look is a question, and will it look like an ape building? Maybe that's the other alternative. Yes?
Would it be too simplistic to ask whether you would give a computer a vote? And have we already done that by letting computers run the stock market, which had to crash at one point?
Yeah, I mean, I'd turn that around and say, do you think computers are increasingly designing what they want buildings to look like? Are they voting, in a sense, visually? I mean, your question seems to imply it's the old fear of the machines taking over. It has a kind of. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
To that point, there have been some extremists already claiming that they have a right.
Mm-hmm.
It might be that they change our ways of thinking and have a reflexive influence on us as using them as tools. If they still are that. But when do we actually consider them to have a will or anything of that sort?
Well, again, I think that goes to that goes back to the 20s and earlier, when technology was becoming domesticated and anthropomorphized, and that this is in a sense just the latest iteration of something which has been around for a long time. But the question is then, I think what's different here is the sense of the morphing between inanimate and animate. That, we were talking about people in the year 2000 who had pacemakers made in that can't change over the date. Are they going to have their bodies reopened? I mean, and reprogrammed. I mean, there are all sorts of things that are that are in the foreseeable future anyway, where the question of material, human matter itself, being more and more fully morphed between the animal and the inanimate. That's where some of this, I think a lot of the current culture is driving. I mean, it's all these novels that I was citing, many of them are about taking apart legacies of humanist representation that one can see very clearly in your question, can they vote? Well, that's still a humanist model, right? They have wills, they have bodies, they have feelings, they have motivations, and so on and so forth. But I think the shift here isn't so much on to what extent machines resemble people, it's more what kind of being will emerge as biological engineering gets more sophisticated. That's where I'm not too confident here, but yes.
Listening to your presentation, I had the repeated sense of the unreliability of architectural form, of its dubiousness, of its friability and corruptibility, its metamorphic and generally contingent character in such a way that of all the things that the universe may possess or consist in, architecture is just about the doggiest, really. And that somehow the medium in which your characters live, although it may contingently or from time to time possess architectonic characteristics, it in fact always seems to be in the process of leaving one state and becoming another. And in this sense, it seems to me that the environment that you're describing seems to be a sort of specialization of forms of practice that are derived from music and clothing, and speech and rap and dance. Now, those I see as having been the characteristic forms of cultural expression and resistance on the part of Afro-American and indeed other dispossessed groups, as if indeed architecture to core, as it were, was simply the possession of establishment groups. And you seem to be describing, anticipating a sort of post-architectural world.
Well, I think a lot of the discussion of space is about that, actually. I mean, it's where instead of imposing an architectural form that's readily legible as such, certainly Delaney is quite concerned with that notion of paraspace, which he would probably substitute for architecture, but it is the sort of the urban wreckage or terrain vague, no man's land areas that he's interested in representing, and not necessarily just within the city, but also as they come into the home. That was why I was very struck by that house of Axe, which is part wasteland and part domestic interior, and where people sort of, instead of acknowledging that, they block away, they just block off the part and become, they live in a kind of survivalist mode in whatever space proves habitable, and that can change. And this whole question of epistemologically about what space you acknowledge is there and what is not seems to be part of this. So I think I would displace your question about architecture to the emphasis here on different kinds of spaces that aren't necessarily made by architects. They are what they are there, and they are what they are. It's certainly in Delaney's fiction a post-architectural world in that sense, in what you're describing. And I'm sure somewhere in this talk there is an implication that maybe that's the next wave. But it's also the fact that architecture, as I understand it, is so linked to clients and commercial sites and so on, and rarely does have to address interstitial zones. And yet, of course, it always does. It's always negotiating those zones. So this would be a question of recognizing that, and perhaps as, insofar as it is space and it is architecture, as urban fabric and so on, as more than just the urban fabric that has to be gotten out of the way while you then do a project. So it would imply some sort of active negotiation of that, as opposed to anything just holistically post-architectural, because I don't think I was really getting at that so much as looking at some of these fictions as places where zones of outer space or alien zones within public realms are constantly coming up against and abutting the projects, say, or actively attacking them, subjecting them to decay and so on, eating them.
I think one of the problems, one of the things that it's very difficult to kind of think out is that, in a sense, the emerging kind of logic that you describe, it makes it very difficult to think that pleasure would any longer be consistent with, like, the pleasure principle. I mean, as if in fact, it's very difficult to kind of think, in terms that pleasure could ever be satisfied with the return to kind of homeostasis,
Mm-hmm.
and that, as it were, pleasure becomes so sort of excessive or catastrophic that it's very difficult to kind of think in what sense would there be a regulation of pleasure that is, as it were, consistent as itself, rather than stopping it or something.
Well, that's where Deleuze and Guattari, I think, are probably, pretty effective theorists of. They would see cities as these kind of desiring machines in that sense of on off, and.
Are there any other questions? One more from that.
Just in relation to the images which you showed from the Black Arts Collective, I think you mentioned there would seem to be presence of a kind of radical political agenda, or a suggestion of that, perhaps even in the name. And I wondered about the way that sits next to Blues and Guitars, a picture of smooth space, and in the way that it relies quite heavily on the stride space as well. I mean, the point perhaps, well,
No, keep going, because I would sort of agree. I don't know if there's a question there.
I just wondered if there is a kind of indeterminacy between the smooth and the stride. But I wonder, it occurred to me that perhaps that indeterminacy might be present also in the retrofuturism of the Black Arts Objective.
The Black Audio Collective. The Black Audio Collective is really, I don't know if they are espousing an aesthetic. It is an archive of an epiphenomenon within black culture. That is this whole kind of futurological vein of popular expression. So through the interviews and the clips and so on, I think there is definitely, I think, there's a politics about it, because I think until this kind of work came along, the temptation is simply to write off Clinton and company as escapist or paranoid. This would be the going way one would describe this. You wouldn't take this seriously as a kind of radical figuring of alien-ness and use it for its sort of bizarre formal suggestions for its historical archiving, its totally heterodox use of references, its time traveling and so on, which I think are very suggestive and funny and self-ironizing in some ways and not, But so the point is that until the Black Audio Collective came along and I think framed it as a phenomenon, or until a few of the people they interviewed started working on this phenomenon, it would just simply be dismissed as a kind of black subcultural phenomenon, escapist or paranoid, right? What?
But
Yeah.
dismissed by whom? Academics? It wasn't dismissed by the people who were into it.
No, but it hasn't,
It's been framed for quote-unquote us.
Right. Well, yeah, the question of,
Quote-unquote.
let's just say it probably didn't lead into anything it didn't have a chance to sort of take off in the mainstream, in a larger culture. Now, of course, there is a, but I think even in terms of, a lot of black artists, it was probably, it's only recently that there's been this re-examination. I mean, before, as I was working on this, I had a long conversation with Renee Green. She was saying that part of what her longer paper is about is, why is this important for black artists in the 90s? Why now? That's really a question that she's concerned with, because in the 80s, she didn't pay attention to this. So I think it's not so much a question of, which is fair enough, that for whom is anything important when you have different audiences, different publics. But the real issue, I think, is that there's some resonance to all of this in the current moment, that's to do with millennial fascinations with representing the alien, and with returning to the 70s. By the same token, returning to the 70s as a kind of source book of kind of astral surrealism, and that is also has a kind of, that also maintains within it a drive to represent race. And I think the difference in terms of, it's not just any 70s. We see it in the larger moment, this kind of obsession with the 70s. In the 90s, that's a whole other problem. But there's something specific here, which is that it is Afrofuturism that's being returned to at the moment. I mean, to come back though to this question of, I mean, I'm not sure I can answer it between the smooth and the striated. I mean, I think that would bear looking into more deeply, the question of, I mean, I don't know. Do you have any further thoughts on that? I mean,
No, I think you're right, really, that the answer probably lies in the minutiae of the work.
mhm. Mhm.
Without actually looking in detail, much more detail. I don't know.
Well, I'll have to think about that more.
Okay, well, I should just say before we end that Emma's kind of agreed to meet with us and the graduate students tomorrow morning here at 11, and anyone else would like to kind of join us to kind of continue the discussion of the paper, then we're very welcome. But anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.